Whenever there's a large open-ended game aiming at a mass audience like Hollow Knight Silksong, I like to ask, is this game elevating taste? Is this game acting as a strong entry point into quality game design, or is it simply trying to appease as many people as possible by any means necessary? And that's often the trend that we're seeing recently, especially with modern remakes and reboots, where they took what was once a good core idea in game design and just sand away at any elements of individuality or friction in the pursuit of this smooth, emotionless experience where the game kind of just plays itself and you go along for the ride. And this trend has become so pervasive that it's gone from being a style of design to being seen as the proper version of game design. And what's been created is this really strong aversion to punishment where players feel like the game having consequences is wasting their time or not up to date. But in the case of Hollow Knight Silksong, I was really excited to see that it's pushing against these trends and instead taking a more classical approach to creating a sequel by building off of legacy skill, by introducing more limitation, more consequences, and in short, making a real game. So the first thing that I like about Silksong is that it establishes a strong baseline moveset. This is very critical for a metroidvania or other progression-based genres because the entire balance of the game is built on this baseline. So if the baseline is too underdeveloped or uninteresting, that puts way too much emphasis on the progression elements, Euro shmups. But if the baseline is too powerful and permissive, then the progression elements lose meaning and the game just gets easier and easier and easier, and you can't keep that tension of difficulty and consequences. So you need to find that exact Goldilocks point with your baseline moveset where it's developed enough that you could feasibly play through the majority of the game in this style, but there's still room for growth that feels meaningful. So in terms of creating limitation within the specific mechanics, first off, there is no iframe roll or iframe dash. This is very in vogue right now. And then on top of that, at the end of Hollow Knight 1, there is an iframe dash. And so I could see many cases of lesser developers deciding, you know what, let's make that part of the baseline moveset. But I'm really glad that they didn't. And why it's really important that something like this is not included in the baseline moveset is because everything else in the game's balance needs to be viable without iframe rolls, right? So when you're fighting the bosses, they can't be designed around the concept of rolling through an iframe attack like we see in Enter the Gungeon, like we see in lots of games that include iframe dashes in their baseline moveset. So it's funny to comment on the lack of something like this, but I think it's very important to acknowledge because it is something that would have been very likely in another developer's hands. And then of course, there's the shift to the pogo downward attack. Now, we've seen in games recently, like Ragebound, these pogo types of attacks are very advantageous because it's often able to exploit weak spots on bosses and enemies. It's something that's a very powerful mechanic. And so by creating some limitations around it, I think that helps bring the rest of the move set into more meaningful conversation, because otherwise, like in Ragebound, you just would pogo your way all day, every day. So I like the shift that they made. It's funny because I've seen people complaining about this for this very reason, but remember, don't just view game design from the perspective of yourself as a player. Try to think about it more holistically with its balance. And so by forcing you to commit to this diagonal angle, that's forcing you to take a risk. And then on top of that, it has a very specific range. So you can't just jump way up in the air and then diagonal attack down with this long, safe hitbox in the front of you, because you have to get kind of close that helps bring the move more into balance, especially because it has a pretty big startup before it comes out. So you can't just use this reflexively to get yourself out of trouble in a lot of cases. You need to anticipate something's coming. You need to have a bit more knowledge, commitment. These types of limitations really help keep the combat system more holistic, and I think it's a fantastic shift. And apparently, once you get familiar with abusing the pogo attack, you can still get up to some shenanigans with its iframes and with its startup, and you have the later, stronger unlocked versions. So there's still some tweaking that needs to be done, but the key is that the baseline idea is limitation. And so if they need to shift things with patches, that's much more viable than basing the entire combat system around abusing iframes in the first place. Another one is the pushback. And so when you hit enemies, they get pushed back. When you get hit, you get pushed back. This is a way to keep the melee system more active because you can't just run up and camp out. Every time you deal a hit, you have to readjust your position. You have to commit to moving forward. And so that pushback, it may seem like a subtle mechanic, but it really adds a lot of dimension to enemy interaction and the melee system itself. Just look at the lace fight. Without this style of pushback, the melee combat would be a sloppy mess. You need something to reset the neutral game and keep spacing active. Another fantastic feature is the game's health and recovery system. Its boom or bust approach, where on one hand, you're able to heal all at once. There is a commitment to this in terms of spacing and having to be active while in combat. I love that. They obviously get this from Souls, and it's a great idea. But to offset that, now you take double damage and have a pretty limited health bar. This is a great choice because it prevents what I call resource snowing. And this happens in a lot of action games, especially of the metroidvania variety, where all you need to do to beat a boss encounter is get a good idea for the early phases and kind of optimize that. And then you can just freely tank a bunch of hits and
use resources
to carry you through the end of the encounter, especially if you abuse iframes. That's another great thing Silksong does. It reduces the amount of recovery iframes. And so what it creates is this great system that is flexible, but only to a point. You still have to learn and master all of the phases because you can't just fall back on resources to get you through to the end. Another fantastic choice was to have your skills share silk meter with the healing, because with these types of systems, you want the offensive options and defensive options to be in tension with one another. Because if you have the skills on their own separate meter, then why won't you just always spam them and use them at every opportunity? Because DPS is the god of these types of informal systems. But by tying it to the healing, now you've introduced a proper counter incentive. For example, with the parry skill that you can get later on. Of course, that's going to be kind of overpowered, but imagine the parry skill, but it did not affect your healing at all. You could see how these systems would start to override the natural gameplay, and we see this constantly in modern meter systems. So by introducing this double-sided cost, the system overall remains more balanced. And I love how the enemy design will actually tie in with this, where there's certain enemy types that will steal your silk to use it as attacks against you, or the maggot water enemies will drain your silk to prevent you from healing. Everything being more interactive and integrated like this is what really helps Silksong stand out not only among Metroidvanias, but just games generally at the moment. One of the biggest design challenges of Metroidvania is the relationship between the enemies and the open world. Where in the beginning, you're not sure where to go, you don't have all the abilities unlocked, and maybe you're hungry for resources, enemy combat and interaction has some meaning and purpose, and you're incentivized to engage in it. Silksong even goes so far as to creating costs for checkpoints, which I think is a great idea. So in the early game, enemies have more of a role, but as you unlock more abilities, and even as you just memorize the layout and placement of the enemies in the rooms, they stop being active threats and start becoming just these inconvenient speed bumps that don't really add much to the experience of the game. You can really see this in Symphony of the Night, the contrast between the early section of the game and the late sections where you're just turning into a bat and charging through the rooms and just speeding past everything along the way. This is something that is a problem across all of Metroidvania, and even late Silksong with Act 3 suffers from this. But one thing that can really help alleviate this, that I'm really happy to see Silksong doing, is upgrading the enemy design, making the enemy behavior much more dynamic and giving the enemies distinct game plans. This is something that is very well done in Final Fight and classic beat-em-ups, but as time has gone on, really robust dynamic enemy design is one of the big weak points of modern games, especially now because enemies have become more like utilities for mechanics than actual natural opponents with built-in game plans. Or even worse, games like Vampire Survivors, where all the enemies uniformly walk towards you and are just pure damage sponges. This has been a real lacking element of gaming lately, and it is probably my favorite aspect of Silksong. I love how well designed the enemies are. Not only do I think this will be healthy for Metroidvanias moving forward and setting a really nice standard for, okay, this is how you design enemies, but on top of that, I think other genres now need to step their game up a bit if a freaking Metroidvania is having more robust enemy design. So I'll just point out some of the things that I like. For example, these little bell creatures, the choir bell bearer, on their own, they're not really that threatening, but you'll notice how they are made specifically to have the game plan of being evasive while peppering you with little projectiles. And so once you take something like that and then mix it in with a more aggressive melee style enemy, like the Reed or like the Chorister or like both of them together, then the strengths of the individual enemies start to cover over the weaknesses of their comrades, and you get a very dynamic united front. And it's not something you almost ever see in Metroidvania, because in most Metroidvania, even the pretty good ones, the enemies are just these individual entities that don't conspire together, they don't work together, they don't synergize, they just sort of float in their own individual universe. Whereas by having sets of enemies who have their own behaviors and patterns and having them overlapping together, that creates a ton of natural variation. And I think my favorite section of Silksong is that last grouped enemy fight at the end of Act 2. It's great, and I think a massive highlight. So Silksong is going above and beyond what a lot of games are doing right now in terms of enemy design, and it is something that really pays off. It's no secret that I'm a fan of older games like Super Metroid and Rondo of Blood, but a gold star I have to give the new era of Metroidvania, specifically Silksong here, is the boss design. I love this approach to the bosses, and you can tell this is where they put a lot of time, focus, and energy, not only visually how the bosses look, but also how they blend together these shmup bullet hell patterns and dynamic movement mixed in with action platformer melee close quarters combat. Putting those two together seems like a pretty tricky balancing act, and I think Silksong pulls it off extremely well. For example, the Grandmother Silk fight, I love the way it has overlapping needle attacks, and then on top of that, they'll also bring in the spikes to close off the amount of screen and contain the player. This is a real highlight of a fight, and I think it shows the strengths of the system really well, especially considering it doesn't have any movement inertia, unlike all of its other premium gaming peers like Shinobi Art of Vengeance and Ragebound, where you've just got to have that movement inertia for that proper game dev school feel. It's a funny bell curve, actually, where brand new indie developers don't put inertia into their games because they don't think to do that. Why would you? But then you go to game design school or classes or whatever, and then you think, oh, let's put in inertia so it feels nice and immersive and premium and physics. And then the really cool kids like Hollow Knight and like Zero Ranger, they're like, no, because this actually gets in the way of the precision of the gameplay and the reliability of the patterns. And so I really appreciate Silksong not using movement inertia and instead using just amazing animation. But anyway, it's really felt during the boss fights. Another favorite of mine was the Lace encounter, the final version, where you have this great footsie style game where she'll do not only individual attacks, but also strings. There's even parries you need to bait out and punish. It's surprisingly active for a two-dimensional melee sword fight. That's a very hard concept to pull off without it being just kind of lame or simplistic. And I also really like that the attacks don't use color-coded warnings to tell you exactly what attack would be coming. That's something I think a lesser developer would do. The fact that you have to read the animation brings in that bit of ambiguity that helps this fight feel more vibrant and skill-based. So having the foresight to not do that, I really appreciate a lot. And the fight that saved the game's pace for me is Trobio. Trobio comes exactly where he's needed because in that back little bit of Act 2, things start to drag with exploration and some platforming sections that aren't really that interesting. And just when you're like, ooh, I'm feeling that fatigue setting in, that Metroidvania fatigue, Trobio shows up and is like a celebration of combat and of game design. And the encounter is really fun. The character design is really fun. And as much as I think they made strides with the level design and the enemy design and having consequences, we have to also recognize that what holds the structure of this game together are these boss fights. They are the pillars upon which everything else rests upon because they really are needed to give that extra shot of energy to the game design. It's not all the boss fights are complete 5 out of 5s, of course. The early ones are pretty boring and easy, and then some of the extra ones in Act 3 just seem really underdeveloped. But the later mandatory ones especially really stand out as well done. And unfortunately, on launch, there is not a boss rush, but I'm expecting for it to come at some point, and I think that will be a major highlight of the game. I think they did a fantastic job here, and I don't understand the complaints about the difficulty of the game because how are you going to get those emotional stakes and meaningful design without giving the bosses some kind of teeth? Which, of course, I very much appreciate. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you a very special discussion of a surprisingly complex and controversial topic: boss runbacks. Are they good? Are they bad? Is this legit game design? Or is this, as I've seen in many comments, not respecting the player's time? I have found that it is actually quite tricky to evaluate this, but we're going to at least try to set some baseline understanding of what's happening with these. So, first off, if you want to remove boss runbacks, that is actually completely possible. All you need to do is play in the permadeath mode, which is an official mode of Silksong, which I very much appreciate. And so if you never want to do another boss run back again, just play under permadeath conditions. And if you die, you won't have to run back the boss. You'll just have to play the entire game again. I want to start there because I think it's important to remember that permadeath is not this new trendy thing that roguelikes invented. Permadeath was the baseline system of punishment going back to the arcades. And so in the arcade era, if you wanted to punish failure, you got a game over reset, go back to the beginning, and then from there, you would feel that very strong sting. And so what ended up happening is that as games got more consoleized and moved away from the permadeath system, they started introducing these compromises of passwords, and then checkpoints, and then save stations. And so as games became more and more progression based and they started to move away from lives and permadeath, a legitimate question has emerged, which is, in a progression-based system where failure is not punished overall by removing progress and instead is just about resetting progress backwards a little bit, how do you punish failure? On the Super Nintendo, it was something like you get a set of lives, and then when you'd make it to the boss, you'd have a certain amount of tries, but then once you ran out of those tries, you'd have to reset back to either the beginning of the land or the beginning of the stage. And so you didn't have these discrete runbacks, but you'd have to play through the level again. But as we've gotten more open world, segmented, then there's no concept of levels necessarily, so you can't set them back to the beginning of the level. But is just setting them back to the beginning of the boss legitimate punishment enough? That's the problem, because we've gotten so punishment averse now that it legitimately feels like any sort of set backwards is now going too far on the developer's part. So then the player should just instantly start back at the beginning of the boss. But then how do you create an emotional experience? How do you actually get the player to feel tension, to feel fear, to feel dread, if the punishment is just resetting a slight bit of progress? And the way I'm describing this attitude sounds extreme, and it is extreme, but this is what is being discussed. I saw Eurogamer do a video about this, and not only were they concerned about runbacks in boss encounters, they were worried about runbacks just in general game design. And it keeps coming up. Flow, fun. These are great buzzwords, but what does that mean in practical game design? That means the removal of punishment. If you can't have permadeath, if you can't have lives, if you can't even have lengthy checkpoints, not only on bosses, but in the general level design, what does that leave you in terms of challenge and punishment and consequences? All that leaves you is just these slight bits of moving backward, these tiny halts in progression. And you do actually see this in things like Ragebound, and you see this being celebrated. And so with this discussion of runbacks, I agree there needs to be some sense of balance, which I'll get to here shortly. But this idea of having any sort of consequence, I'm very glad Silksong is pushing against. And even if it's not perfect, I think it speaks to the integrity of its design. Because in a system where there are stakes to encountering the bosses, you'll find that your behavior actually changes. Like if you're in a very long section without a checkpoint anywhere nearby and you get into a boss encounter, you're playing a lot more carefully. You're trying to read what the boss is going to do. You may not even go in to do punishments at first. You're just trying to get your bearings, see what's happening, and then you slowly start to get more aggressive. So it actually shifts your mentality. It actually shifts the way you interact with the bosses. It actually shifts the way you play. And so these are all the desired effects I think we want to see in terms of punishment in this type of system. But I do think there is a fair critique of how this is being accomplished with the boss runback, because back in a permadeath system, the benefit is that you'd have to retest all of your skills in playing consistently overall. So it'd be a much more natural, holistic test to get back to that boss. But in the boss runback, especially in the ones where you're just running down a hall or going up a very, very light set of platforming, it doesn't necessarily create the emotional stakes that you're kind of hoping for, especially as you get more habituated to this. Now just becomes another section of downtime. And what's especially a problem in a metroidvania or a lot of action RPGs is that the design of these games already have lots of traversal and downtime and these kinds of padded sort of sections, even outside of boss runbacks. And so what you would want is you would want the boss runback downtime to feel like a specific punishment, like a walk of shame, as I've seen people described in Dark Souls and Demon Souls. And if you look at Demon Souls especially, I think the boss runbacks work there very well because one, it doesn't actually have checkpoints, right? You have the area that you have to begin at, and then it has the natural shortcut in the level design, but there is no midpoint bonfire style checkpoint that breaks up this structure. And because the level design and the pace of that game is so tight and constrained, then when you're doing these runbacks, it feels like a distinctive punishment. But as you make the maps bigger, as you make traversal more of a standard of your gameplay, then this punishment element of the boss runbacks loses its meaning. And that's often what people are saying about Silksong's runbacks, is they feel more like the developer's just not thinking about it enough, rather than the developer making a clear statement of like, no,
this is your walk of shame.
But I will say, in terms of playing the game for time, which is something the game measures and I know is a feature that people care about, speedrunning and everything, the runbacks are at least punishing you in that sense, because if you're trying to get a good clear time, then you're adding a punishment there. But for the average player, I don't think that's enough of a convincing reason to have those runbacks in there in the manner that they're in. So where I kind of end up on them right now, unfortunately, is I tolerate them, I kind of accept them to some degree, but I do think they've got to come up with some other better solution that isn't just giving in to, all right, just instant restart if you fail, because then you're losing that whole emotional punishment type of thing, and you get into that ugly, just constant forward progression, punishment aversion that is really inflicted upon stuff like Ragebound. And the push against that Silksong is doing, I very much appreciate. So yeah, that's boss runbacks as I see it right now. So far, I think it's safe to say that I've been vibing with Silksong. I've been connecting with this game a lot more than I expected, and I'm honestly finding it to be a very refreshing release, especially after playing Ragebound and a lot of the modern stuff that's been coming out lately.
So yeah, good vibes.
But the place where I disconnect with Silksong is at the end of Act 2, after you see the credits and after you get the permadeath mode unlocked. For me, I'm like, perfect. Great scale, great amount of content. Could be a little bit harder in the early game, but still a fun experience. I'm interested in playing in permadeath conditions. It's nice and contained. And then Act 3. The best way I can describe this in terms of structure is Act 1 and 2 is Dark Souls. So you get to the end of Dark Souls, it's a similar pace, it's a similar scale, it's kind of a similar difficulty and everything, a very equivalent experience in a Metroidvania. You get to the end of Dark Souls, and after you beat Dark Souls, you unlock Elden Ring. And Act 3 just goes Elden Ring mode in a Metroidvania context. And all the things that I find personally kind of uninteresting about Metroidvania design start to appear more, where you've got a lot of map navigation, you've got a lot of go here, go there. You get carrots in between of the boss fights, but there's a lot of time. The map is enormous. It's like freaking San Andreas or some crap like that. Giant map, things spread all over the place, and you kind of go on this questing mode to find bosses. And this is something that I personally experienced that I wonder if other players connect with or not, which is what I'd like to call map fatigue. And these days, most games have big, sprawling open worlds, so this isn't unique by any means to Metroidvania, but I think Metroidvania these days struggles with this issue the most because of the way it creates its relationship to its map. Because if you go back and think about the origins of Metroidvania, of course, Metroid that era, you had a much smaller map. And so the way the game design worked was to keep updating your relationship with that small area by finding new abilities. And so if you look at this great post Boghog put up about the ways the player relates to the map, you'll see that you have different functions as you're playing, but the two that really stand out in Metroidvania are temporal mapping and proofreading. So the way this works in a Metroidvania specifically is that every time you get a new ability, you need to re-update your entire interpretation of the map. So of course, in Super Metroid with something like Power Bomb, once you unlock that, your entire relationship with a lot of the rooms change. But what you need to do as a player is you need to constantly reinterpret the areas that you've already explored. And that works relatively well if you have a small selection of abilities and a relatively small map. But what's happening in modern Metroidvania, and we definitely see it being a problem here in Act 3, is that as the map
swells in size,
it becomes increasingly more exhausting to constantly refresh this amount of information. Is this the third version of the map? Is this the fourth version of the map? All right, what ability do I need where? And so what ends up happening in practice is something that Bog calls proofreading. I think this is a perfect way to describe it. Like when you're a kid and you're doing a word search and you just manually scan the lines one by one, that technique will always work. It is completely solvable, but it's just costing you a lot of tedium, which is why I think the boss runbacks from the previous section end up getting a lot more critique than I feel they kind of deserve. It's because the tedium that you already experience in the map navigation, the boss runbacks are like the straw that broke the camel's back. You are actually annoyed by this process, but because it's a novel process where you're not sure what's at the other end of it, you're kind of suspending your disbelief. But once you know what's on the other end of it, you're like, oh, this. Which is why I think if this style of design was tightened up, and it didn't have this sort of micro backtracking and instead structured itself more like Dark Souls, which I will say Act 1 through 2 does. If you just play through the mandatory stuff, which is how I play, it actually does not have nearly as much map fatigue because it flows through without much backtracking. But Act 3, baby, that's when it goes full Symphony of the Night, inverted castle and everything. And also, with this whole map navigation, quote unquote, skill, don't forget, this is just a novelty because once you know it, you know it. It's not something dynamic. It's not something that changes and shifts. It's just doing homework because once you know the entire map, there's no longer a skill element to this. You're just going to now follow the sequence. And now, because of this structure, even if you know exactly where you're going, you know exactly what you're doing, you still have to endure a bunch of tedium. So in regards to this style of level design, I don't think developers can just fall back on tradition because once you make the map this huge, you're entering new territory that's going to require a different relationship, at least in my opinion. But I've seen a lot of people when they're hitting Act 3, they're like, oh boy. And what's interesting, I will say to Silksong's credit, is that Silksong must identify this phenomenon to some degree because of the way it breaks Act 2 into an actual ending with credits. And so if you're a player like myself and you get to Act 2 and you're like, we're good here, the game is giving you an actual off-ramp for the developer to kind of acknowledge, all right, you're good, you've had your game, you can go home now. And then all of the Metroidvania Explorer guys, here comes Act 3. And I would be perfectly fine with that, except those boss fights. Those Act 3 boss fights, the good ones, they're trapped out there in the wilderness. I feel like it doesn't quite know what to do with this structure. It's very choose your own adventure. For example, completion percentage. When you get to the end of the game, you get the true ending. Okay, you've actually formally beaten the game. And then you've got this completion percentage that appears. What are you supposed to do with this number? Because it feels like if you do anything under 100%, you're not really honoring this system, right? So if you finish the game at 80% completion, is that valid? Is that a valid playthrough of the game? Is there a meaningful difference between finishing the game at 80% versus 40% or whatever? It feels like the game is kind of telling you, because you have no other sort of way to create value, well, okay, no, you want that 100%. I think that's where this structure sort of struggles, because it's kind of trying to get the best of both worlds, where it's giving you a goal, okay, get 100% completion, but then it's not fully taking responsibility for what that 100% completion ends up looking like and the dynamics along the way. It doesn't need to be as tight and focused as the main campaign. So I don't think Act 3 works as well as 1 and 2 from my perspective, but since it is so big and such a massive bit of content, it's almost like its own game, right? Is Hollow Knight Silksong Act 1 and 2? Is it Act 3? Is it all of them together? It's segmenting itself up, but it's kind of leaving these a bit up to interpretation. So my personal recommendation is play Act 1 and 2, complete the main game, maybe go for the mandatory bosses in Act 3, definitely play the permadeath mode for Act 1 and 2. And real quick, I want to point out a pretty serious flaw with this game's permadeath mode, because I really appreciate this inclusion. I think permadeath needs to be more prominent of a design philosophy in these styles of games in terms of making them more consistent and skill-based, but there is a huge glaring oversight with how this permadeath mode works, because you can save and quit out. And so if you're just about to die, just pause, save, quit out, and you have preserved your playthrough.
No, naughty Team Cherry, naughty.
They need to look at Shirin as an example, because if you try these shenanigans, the game will just
Special beam cannon.
And that's really important. You can't have an honor-based system in something that's supposed to be a skill-based completion. So obviously what they need to do is, if you want to save and quit, you have to do it at a bench. Not if you're stuck in a sticky situation in the levels or you're about to die in a boss fight. Come on, this needs to be enforced. And what I'm planning on do is hanging tight and keeping an eye out for the boss rush, which will be a more formal way to bring this content all together. And I really hope when they do the boss rush, they don't just have bosses, they also have the group enemy encounters, and you can kind of get a mix of both, which would be another game within a game. Yeah, there's so many games within games. It's like a Russian nesting doll of a release, that's for sure. So in conclusion, Silksong is excellent. The quality of its art is insane. And for once, a game with this scale, with this level of mainstream appeal, with this level of production quality, is actually using this opportunity to challenge its existing audience and elevate their taste, and to move the genre of Metroidvania, I think, in a much stronger direction that it was going before Silksong existed. I think this is a nice, subtle shift in the paradigm that I very much appreciate. It's bringing back the value of punishment. It's bringing back the values of commitment and limitation. Is it perfect in these regards? No, but no other Metroidvania is either. And I think it's able to extend its consequences and that tension that you usually only get in the early phases of Metroidvania much further than a lot of its peers. And I can see it being just a very strong example of game design moving forward, and something I could see myself citing as really excellent, especially in terms of its combat design, in its enemy design, in its art design, in the lack of inertia. And maybe these types of strives forward will have a very healthy, beneficial effect on everything else around it. You know it's a good game, it's doing something right, if its difficulty is annoying a lot of mainstream reviewers and mainstream critics, and it's like driving them up the wall. It's like, oh, there's actual consequences here. I sense a game designer made this, right? Rather than a committee of play testers and feedback who just constantly chop away at any sense of artistic identity. So hopefully this will encourage more bold design moving forward. And if you enjoyed this review, I definitely recommend checking out my review of Dark Souls. I think it's a little bit slept on, and a lot of what I talk about in Dark Souls and its nature of its design is going to translate pretty much one-to-one to Silksong. There is a massive overlap between them, and I'm not just saying that because every game is compared to Dark Souls, as my thumbnail indicates. No, there's something genuinely deeper happening there. So if you can, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. And I'm a full-time YouTuber, so if you can support me on Patreon, that would be fantastic. The Patreon is the backbone of how this channel happens, and I really appreciate that support. And there's also a lot of really cool exclusive content on there. I just posted a video about the dangers of psychology-based design, which I think will be relevant just moving forward for a lot of the upcoming reviews. Thanks so much. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons: 100, Absconditis, Eternal Solitude, Handhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Alderin, Alex Kors, Alexander Pfeiffer, AMH, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, A Royal Guard, Arrow Viper, Ash FL, Au Ally, Autoname, Baron Metzigerstein, Battle Mode, Basil Me Dazzle, Bellator Poeta, Ben Foster, Benjamin Shabalski, Vito Dames, Boghog, Borgie22, Boston Crab, Brokeface, Brindale Swiftfoam, Brodequin the Lonely Poet, Bruh, Wem, Captain Rhodes, Captain Shrimp, Catchright Studio, Cat and Crack, Cha, Chad Goulding, Chamor Decluet, J-Flip, Kristen SoCal, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Cipollino 0404, Clairvoyant Bongwater, Claire Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, CMD, Coast, Concreted, Cooksand 666, Cook Some Soup, Corio, Corn Hoglin, Cozy, Crew Expendable, CSP 3900, Kudo, CZR, Des Audio, DRK, Damian Thorne, Dan Matai, Danchi, Darren Griffin, That Guy, David Aldris, David Crespo, Dididum, Demian Smirnoff, Deram, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Diodamke, DJ420 Praise It, Don Pedro, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Drayton Barrett Raton, Duckies, Easter Egg, Eduardo Oquinta, Edvard, Elvin Senisev, Elias Alonso, Empty Disco, Eric Shrivner, Eric Houdini, Esteban Lizama, Evan Serafet, Explosive General Games, Fabio Picci, Falcus, Benich Mathai, Firez, Five Side, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Gabriel Forner, Game Soup, Game Boy Gru, Gelhoff, Gettershine, Gojira Green, GPM, Hawk, Hamadawama, Hans Kowalski, HDZ 274, Pure Death, Thomas Hardhat, Han Harthy, HUD, Humongous, HW Folder, Iran DMS, JDab, Jurgen, Jack Walsh, Jacob Foley, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, James Mosca, Jason, Jay McCarthy, J67, JLab, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, JMD, Joey Jojo Joestar, JOH, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Slaylise, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Josh Mayer, Josie, JT, Julian Elwood, K, K2, Kane Evans, K-O-Tune, Ken10082, Kill All Music, King Joker, Kinstro, Contain, Praise the Boys, Kumawamu, Kumama, Kyarts, Kyrol, Leonard McCoy, Loberta, Lobos, Luna Lalich, LZR Cuter, Macabre Monster, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Mario Simic, Mark Mann, Mason Polar, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Matau Batau, Maz, Makaroka, Minong, Meister, Men's Raya 96, Metal Slime Drummer, Michael Del Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Mig ZDM, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morag, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Musashi, Miles P, Mishkin, Naps91, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Neon Ninja, Nervous J, Neuroshima, Nicholas Reichman, Nikki Negative, Nilheim, Neo04, Okla Kugels, Oleg Talmasev, Panther Dragoon should have been arcade, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Howell Parole, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, Pizza Belly, Platinum Mad, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Psychovania, Queen Charlene, Quilon Jaeger, R2 Sinus, Raccoons, Raphael Trujillo, Randoom, Raul VP, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Rent Halt's Time, Repo Man, Retrojet, Retroman, Retro Schmupper, Richter, Riff Mason, Robert Chang, Roop Olander, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Running Aku, Salmon Connections, San Nevo, Sarn, Scanline City, Seymour, Segfault, Senpai Please, Cyril XP Greg, Shader Bunny, Shazzy, Shitsu Supreme, Shinjutsu 1600, Shiny, Shmup Junkie, True, Simply Chrono, Sirapong, Skater to Employ, Social Kid, Sophisticated, Space, Spagward, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synth Milk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, Ted Ray 77, The Dirty Screech, The Kachow, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tom McCarthy, Tim French, T Money, Tofu Man, Tom Faze, Travis Arbon, Tristan, Sugumo, Turam, 2YU, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Typoair, Urokeeper, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vandal, Velenix, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vincetti Brincy, Vizard 16, Vlad STG, Wabbylegs, What Is This? William Miller, William Wallace, Yakiback, Yellow Tello, Your Nerdy Joe, Eastbird, Zachary Patton, Zach Zenryoku, Zingus, Zerolux, Zorpnods.